there are so many people throughout the nation crying and demanding for justice, not only for the families of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and now Rayshard Brooks, but for anyone, so that it doesn't continue to happen again and again and again. And in light of that, there are two different legislations in conversation right now, the GOP-led legislation and the one that the Democratic Party is also pushing. If you can address our viewers and let them know the difference between the two, and what the next steps are to really make sure that the nation moves forward and makes the right decision.
Well, we've seen lots of reform. We've been through this since before I was born. The Kerner Commission came out, and there was a lot of talk and reform, but we still saw a disproportionate killing of unarmed Black men. We've seen all the way reform efforts going all the way up to President Obama's 21st century task force on policing, but we didn't get it done. We're still seeing, as you said, their names, and for every name we know, there are so many that we don't know. And so what I feel is it's not just enough to have reform. We need real accountability, real teeth, that when police officers do wrong, there are consequences, that people in communities have ways of measuring progress of their police departments. That means opening up the data for police use of force, for police misconduct, and more. And in addition to being held accountable in the courts, having transparency, we need to outright ban certain practices, from chokeholds to the no-knock warrants that killed Breonna Taylor. And so the differences between our bill and the Republican bill is just that. Ours has actual accountability, as opposed to encouraging police departments, giving police departments more money, all the things that are in their bill. We say, no, it's time to actually have outright bans on a lot of practices, from racial and religious profiling. It's time to change the standards of accountability, for whether it's for use of force, from a reasonableness standard, to actually make it sure, was it necessary at all to use that force, all the way to criminal prosecutions and civil rights prosecutions, which right now there's a lot of immunity or difficult standards to reach. So our bill has a lot more teeth in it, things that people can use, that when police officers break the law, to hold them accountable for their actions.
Could you see any bipartisan efforts of, sitting down with Tim Scott or sitting down with Republicans to say, hey, we both have the same intentions. Let's draft something that, we can all agree on. Do you see any possibilities of that?
Well, again, I'm a person that, since I got to the Senate, fought very hard to liberate unjustly incarcerated people from prison. People told me it was impossible to do. We found a bipartisan way to get there, and thousands of people, because of our First Step Act, have left prison. So when it comes to justice delayed is justice denied. And while I don't want a bill that takes the knee of injustice off of the neck of African Americans only halfway, I want to see these problems solved. Strides in the right direction I'm willing to do. But right now what we have is high on symbols, very little on substance. And so the way Mitch McConnell seems to be going about this is not putting a bill in committee, trying to build the bipartisan support, have hearings on it. No, he's rushing something to the floor so he could say he did something on this. Anything that comes out of the Senate won't be aligned with the House. This is unfortunately something that they're doing, which is more of an exercise in political theater than the seriousness with which we dealt with criminal justice reform, which is a bunch of senators away from cameras and all the like, trying to hammer out progress. So I'm very frustrated. It looks like next week we're going to a lot of symbolism, a lot of politics on the Senate floor, as opposed to real efforts to actually get something done.
And for someone who may look at you and not see your struggles, right? Growing up, what was your relationship with law enforcement? Did you have experiences of getting pulled over? I mean, the situations that have happened to the 4 victims that we're talking about in the headlines, there's so many other people coming forward sharing their own stories. What's your story?
Well, look, first of all, let's just be real. I don't know a Black man in America that I've met that hasn't had experiences, be they humiliating, be they terrifying, be they moments where they just didn't know if they were one step away from being killed. So yeah, I've had my guns drawn on me, accused of stealing my car, all the way to just being followed in malls. I wrote an essay after the Rodney King verdict where I was just incensed, called "Why Have I Lost Control?" detailing a lot of my own experiences. And the painful thing about this whole situation is that was 1992. It's darn near 30 years ago. And you could literally take that same column I wrote, change the name Rodney King and substitute in Tamir Rice, Eric Garner. You can go through a lot of these names and it would be the same story. And I read most of that article on the Senate floor just to say that how many times are we going to go through these generational cycles where every generation, going back to the Kerner Report, the 60s, going back to the Jim Crow South, going back to the post-Reconstruction era, going back all the way to slave catching. We have not had a period in American history where there has not been serious disparate treatment, tragically so, of African Americans in our country. And the results of this are obvious. You cannot deny that we have a nation that over-incarcerates African Americans, where Black Americans are much more likely to die at the hands of police. They get longer sentences for the same crimes. They're more likely to be this war on drugs. It wasn't a war on drugs. It was a war on people, disproportionately the addicted, disproportionately the mentally ill, and way disproportionately African Americans. In fact, there is no difference in America between blacks and whites for using drugs or dealing drugs. But blacks are about 4 times more likely to be incarcerated for those things. And laws were created to disempower African Americans. When they come out, you have a lifetime sentence for doing things that 2 of the last 3 presidents admitted to doing. Because we've made it so in this country that we're a nation of unfair retribution. You can't get business licenses, you can't get jobs, you can't get loans from your bank. You're put in a position where you can't provide for your family and your children. And in many places in this country still, you can't vote for doing things that Congress people have done using drugs. You now lost your voting rights. And so this is why Michelle Alexander calls it the new Jim Crow. And this is not some system out there. This is a system that if you're Black in America, you've had intimate experiences with an unfair system. And so the question is not, do we all have our stories? Again, I do not know an African-American male. I just had a gathering of a group of African-Americans. We all have our stories. The question is what are we going to do about it in our generation to make sure that kids now aren't teaching their kids to be afraid of the police or to be careful when they're pulled over, to not move their hands suddenly because a cell phone could be mistaken for a gun, because they could be reaching in their glove compartment and get shot, because they could be sleeping in their home and get shot, because they could be jogging in their neighborhood and get shot.
As you mentioned that, it seems that the instructions parents give their children, that list keeps on growing and growing. You know, especially with 2015 and 2017, when we saw case after case after case, those instructions for survival are so lengthy.
Yes, but there are things we can do. That's the thing, we're not helpless. Mm-hmm. Martin Luther King said very powerfully, he said, I can't legislate you to love me, but I can pass laws to stop you from lynching me. I can't pass legislation that will change your heart, but I can pass legislation to restrain the heartless. And so this is very clear. The legislation we have is narrow, and I'll explain why I say that in a second. But it simply says if a police officer does wrong, we're going to change what's called Section 242 so that the federal government can prosecute that police officer. And if a family, and I can give you examples of people that were shielded by filing civil rights charges against somebody in the civil court, you know, whether it was a pregnant woman in Washington who wouldn't, 7 months pregnant, wouldn't sign a ticket that she got, a traffic ticket. So she was dragged out in the streets, tased 3 times. She filed civil rights charges against the police officers that did that. They were shielded by something called qualified immunity. I can give you so many cases where we want to get rid of that shield. That is real accountability. We want to make sure that the activist in the streets here in Newark, or the mayor or whomever wants to look at the details of use of force and misconduct, they can see and have transparency, because sunshine is a great disinfectant. And then finally, there are just things that should be illegal, and we make it illegal what killed Eric Garner. We make it illegal what killed Ahmaud Arbery. So this is a narrow bill that will make things better, but then we have a long further to go. We actually, as a country, have to begin to understand that public safety does not simply mean or necessarily mean more police. Public safety, we know we can make our communities safer by having mental health services, which are woefully inadequate in this country. We treat mental health in jail. And the reality is somebody who's African American is 2.5 times more likely black man over a white man to be killed by the police. But somebody who's got a mental illness is over 10 times more likely to be killed by the police. We know we can be safer if we have those services: addiction counseling, addiction services, issues that deal with environmental injustices. Because I live in a community like many African Americans. In fact, the color of your skin is the most significant determinant of whether you're going to live around toxicity. Drinking dirty water with lead, breathing dirty air around toxic sites. Now, most people don't know this is violence against bodies. When you lead, it literally does damage to children's executive function, permanent brain damage. Makes it more likely for them to act out in school. Next thing you know, they're getting into that school to prison pipeline. So we need to start having more circles of empathy, a greater love in our society, that we're not trying to treat problems in a far more expensive way with police and prisons that demeans and degrades human dignity, and start looking at ways to elevate human potential. And so I tell you, we've been defunding public education. We've been defunding other services in communities, and we need to get back to doing what will really make us safe, secure, and strong in America.
And speaking of defunding, there is a social media campaign where people are asking defund the police. What are your views on that?
Well, again, I want people, before they react one way to 3 words, to go deeper into the spirit of what people are calling for. I can show you studies in America. Seattle did one. What's more expensive to taxpayers? To have people on the streets who are mentally ill and homeless, or to have supportive housing? Well, they ran the numbers and they found out that it is far cheaper to put homeless folks into housing, because if they're left on the streets, they end up in hospital emergency rooms and prisons and jails with police. I sat with the head of the FBI in this city when I was mayor. In my first days as mayor, sat with him for an intelligence briefing on gangs. And I looked at him, wanted to see how he would answer. And I said, well, how do we solve this problem? Meaning the gang problem. And he looks at me and he goes, we don't solve this problem. Meaning law enforcement doesn't solve these problems, where society has failed to address the supports that our children need to succeed. So you talk to law enforcement officers, they know the spirit behind those 3 words is that we are over-reliant on asking them to do things that they don't have the training or to do, as opposed to investing in other things that could actually help the society see less quote-unquote crime and more human flourishing.
Do you think people would believe bystanders if they didn't have those cell phone videos that were captured at the scenes? Whether it's Walter Scott, whether it's Ahmaud Arbery, if those cell phone videos never surfaced, do you think people would believe those who were there, who saw it happen?
Well, we know this already, right? We have seen multiple cases that didn't even pop into the human consciousness until the videotapes, often weeks or months later, were released. So we know the answer to that question. We have factual data on that this is something that is not new. It happens all the time. But now more of us have cell phones, more of it's being captured, and we're forcing America to look at the ugly truth. And so this is what social justice advocates have always had to find ways to do, is to find ways to get people to see the truth. Because, peace, true peace, is not the absence of tension. It's the presence of justice. And so what social advocates do is they find ways to expose the tension in a society, as the civil rights activists did. King wrote a letter to good folks who were doing nothing, who were upset, called rabble rousing. He said, no, I'm just exposing the injustices that are already there in the society. So this is the challenge we have, which is we've grown way too comfortable in our society with the current status quo of injustice. We've grown far too comfortable in a society that incarcerates only 5% of the globe's population, but incarcerates 1 of every 4 people on the planet, 1 out of every 3 women on the planet. We've grown far too comfortable with a society that treats human fragility with prison and jail as opposed to help. And so somehow, and it's video cameras is doing it, but I think protest activists have to continue to do it, because let's be clear, I'm a student of history, as I'm sure you are. No great social movement, labor movement in this country, suffrage movement in this country, civil rights movement in this country, LGBTQ rights movement in this country, even the disability advocates in this country, how we got the Americans with Disability Act, was from courageous protesters who took to the streets to do creative protests, to show people, to make people stare at the injustices. And the bill that I helped to author would not have been possible. We've got the majority of the House of Representatives and close to 40 senators already on the bill that I helped to author with the Congressional Black Caucus leaders, Kamala Harris and others. That bill, we would have never got this many people on it just a month ago. What's making that bill possible is not just the videotapes themselves, which are critical, but now that all 50 states, from small towns to large cities, hundreds of thousands of people are out in the streets, like they were in the labor movement, the suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, demanding change. Power concedes nothing without a demand. And this has to sustain, because right now, as we're going to see next week, through Mitch McConnell and the political theater that they're going to go through, this is not, we're not going to see change happen yet. We've made some progress in the Senate by actually getting bills with people supporting them for real change, but we need to continue the pressure for change in America, and that will only come by people on the sidelines who are getting on the field and helping to make that change happen.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, the civil rights movement, this is a marathon. When you think about the Montgomery bus boycott, it lasted more than 380 days. When you think about Hosea Williams going to Forsyth County in Georgia to confront the Klan, holding one of the largest rallies in the state of Georgia, that took effort. And now that legacy does continue. For this young generation that's hungry to become the leaders of their generation, this young hashtag generation that really has figured out how to connect people all over the world with the power of the hashtag, and they want to become more involved because this has ignited their passion. What do you say to them?
Well, again, don't stop. Just don't stop. Mm-hmm. And find creative ways to sustain, as you said, a movement. This can't be a moment. It has to be a movement. Mm-hmm. And movements take some time. Civil rights legislation, as you indicated, has failed many, many times before it ultimately got passed. And so a lot of politicians are just hoping this will blow over, that things will settle down, that the Republicans will write a bill that is more symbol than substance. And they're hoping that that will just diffuse the energy and the demands of folks in the streets. Well, I hope the opposite. I hope that folks don't relent, that understand that this is going to take sustained effort to get the kind of change that we need. And they should hold their leaders accountable, or they should give the ultimate accountability, which is the consequence that they fail to get and support what the people want, which means this election taking them out of office. And
what was your reaction when President Donald Trump proposed his executive order?
Frankly, I don't care. I don't care. And I'm not going to waste my time trying to get in Donald Trump's head. I have much better things to do with my time. Mm-hmm. And energy and emotional energy, which many of us feel in this difficult time. We need to conserve as much emotional energy for things that actually matter. Mm-hmm. This is the thing. His executive order was nothing in terms of substantive change that people were asking for. So he's not the issue. This is not about Donald Trump. This is not a referendum on him. It's a referendum on us, because you get the change that you demand. It ain't easy always, but I'm telling you, the power of the people is always greater than the people in power. And so this is a time for us at a national crossroads to stop what happens. I do not want, when I was in my 20s, marching in the streets after the Rodney King verdict, I do not want kids in their 20s, young people that are in their 20s right now, to see themselves at 50, seeing the same tortured reality. This is the moment where I'm telling you, we've got the momentum to make the change, but the momentum has to be sustained and the movement has to continue. And I put a lot of faith in the young creativity, the activism, the genius that I'm seeing being manifested through protests right now, the diversity that's out there right now. There is something powerful, special, and different like I've never seen before. And I just hope folks will keep it up, not relent, until we see a nation where a child does not have to worry about their safety and security for doing things that others in this country get to take for granted. My mom was one of those doing sit-ins that there wasn't necessarily them sitting around waiting to see what the older generation was telling them to do. They were out in the streets trying to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. And they did things that were not popular. They didn't worry about popularity. Martin Luther King, when he died and was assassinated, was murdered, most Americans disapproved of him. Now we've turned him into a Santa Clausification, but he was really about challenging America to become maladjusted to injustice as opposed to comfortable with it. And so I just want folks to do what their heart tells them to do. Never let the question in their mind be silenced. What can I be doing for the cause of my country? What can I be doing as an ally? Just what can I be doing? Because as soon as then you get comfortable. And that's what's been the problem so long. Reread the letters from the Birmingham jail. King calls out not the white supremacists and the KKK members and the White Citizens Council. He calls out the moderates who are doing nothing. He calls them out. And that to me is the greatest danger right now, is that people are going to treat this democracy like a spectator sport, stay on the sidelines. They may give some cheers for people out there, but they're not going to think to themselves, how am I complicit in this through my inaction? What can I be doing to get this country moving in the right direction? And every great moment in America, I think of my elderly grandmother, African-American woman, who, let's pick World War II. She was proud of the fact that she had victory gardens, that she had bought war bonds, that she had her ration cards, because she felt like she may be small, but she was doing her part for the larger cause. So the question is to ask yourself, what am I doing? And the answer is nothing, then check yourself, because you are a part of the problem. Now is the time that we need to get more and more Americans involved. And then I'm telling you, just like after those young people, ages 8 to 18 in Birmingham in May of 1963, who challenged Bull Connor and woke the consciousness of this country, segregation fell quickly in Birmingham, 12 days. Everybody was running down to Birmingham. Joan Baez, Dick Gregory, celebrities, everybody was joining, the children, the young people who were leading the way, the activists that were leading the way. And so I don't know how quick things will shift or change, but we need a sustained movement of activists that aren't waiting for permission. They aren't waiting for instruction. They're just getting out there and doing it and challenging and daring people like me in the halls of Congress to lead, follow, or get out of the way. And that's what the magic of this moment is. That's what the potential right now is.
And as you continue advancing the police reform legislation, if you could say anything to George Floyd's family, Breonna Taylor's family, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, if you could say anything directly to them as you continue pushing for police reform, what message do you have for those families who are grieving right now?
We see you. We love you. You're not grieving alone. We're going to do everything we can to make sure that these names, like Mamie Till did with the body of Emmett Till, we're going to make sure that these folks did not die in vain, and that their deaths, tragic, awful, horrific deaths and tortures in the case to see the trauma and the fear in Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd. We're going to make sure that this, out of this tragedy, that we bring some real change, and that's what I'm committed to doing. And I know I speak with millions of Americans who say the same thing. Thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate you very much. Thanks for your journalistic integrity, for your heart, for your spirit that comes through your questions. So wishing everybody the best, and let us celebrate abolition and that freedom by still fighting together today for freedom from fear, freedom from brutality, freedom from violence. We still have work to do on the journey until we're all free at last, and free at last.